you have one of the most popular mainstream podcasters called Tim Pool. And on his show, he was covering New Republic Bank and it going under and all this crazy stuff. At the very end, he's like, guys, I don't want to give you financial advice, but I don't want to tell you what you should do, but I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to buy Bitcoin, right? So slowly but surely that's starting to kind of, the Bitcoin echo chambers slowly starting to break. And then Steven, you were featured in CNBC today in regards to Bitcoin responding favorably to today's CPI print. Is that part of the process? Are people waking up to Bitcoin when they think of that? What's your take?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a few things I could highlight there. One is actually the question that Warren Buffett was asked at his recent seminar, symposium, whatever you call it, meeting. And you had this, you probably saw it online. For those that didn't, you had this like 13 or 16-year-old girl basically come up and ask him about like, what does he think of the status of the US dollar as global reserve currency? Like the subtext being, do you think that's in jeopardy? And his answer, to like summarize it very quickly, was like, it's not looking good. The fact that he gave that answer, the fact that he was asked that question, it's like a containment breach where that discussion was previously limited to like certain pockets of like macroeconomic finance, Twitter, gold bugs, Bitcoiners. And that is now, kind of, there's been a containment breach. Now, is that me saying the dollar is going to lose its role as global reserve overnight? Of course not. There's been many kind of false starts and proclamations there, but you're seeing those concerns, I think, radiate outward into kind of like concentric rings of institutional legitimacy. And that's part of this process too. As far as kind of other comments, yeah, I mean, people are just talking about it more. Grants, which is an interest rate observer, they've been publishing for decades, probably like close to 100 years. I might have it wrong, but they recently had a whole kind of part in their newsletter, in their kind of their dispatch about Bitcoin. And the fact that they're even writing about it at all is one of these signposts. I think discussion is getting larger. I think it is spreading. I think we're seeing adoption. We're also seeing that manifest in the Bitcoin community itself. And what I'm saying there is I've kind of watched this with a lot of curiosity, that from the time I got into Bitcoin to now, it's gotten so much broader, right? You have these different factions within Bitcoin. You have progressives that really like Bitcoin now. You have academics that really like Bitcoin. It's become very broad. And to me, that's what mass adoption looks like. There is no mass adoption if your community stays kind of narrow. It's a specialization, right? And so seeing this expand and seeing all of these different voices and some of these, the BPI guys are phenomenal. I'm thinking of like Troy Cross and Andrew Bailey and Craig Warmke. They're all PhDs. They're all professors that have, literally Troy had a tweet that was like, Bitcoin gave me a new life. It gave me meaning and purpose. And, these are guys that maybe wouldn't have been in like the 2013 cohort, but we're seeing that now. We're seeing Bitcoin reach out and connect with people and motivate people. And to me, this is adoption, right? Like that is what it looks like.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree. And then it really helps us also just, Bitcoiners are just sitting, protected by their orange force field. The longer you've been on a Bitcoin standard, the easier it becomes to hodl, especially if you've been through a couple cycles and you're watching either Janet Yellen or Jerome Powell try to, they asked him a very simple question, like, why 2% inflation? And the mental gymnastics that he went through to try to explain that. And you're just watching.
Do you know where it came from?
No idea.
Came from a random comment by a New Zealand central banker many decades ago. It was like random off the cuff, just like, we're going to target 2%. And it was one of those weird stories where it got enshrined.
And they call us a cult. They're the cult. All right. But anyway, so we had, and that's so interesting. So we have Jerome Powell, and then you have Janet Yellen being like basically questioned about why she was bailing out the big banks and what would the unintended consequences of that be affecting the community banks. But what's really interesting is some comments that came from an anti-Bitcoin congressman. His name is Brad Sherman, and he had some comments. I'm going to play the video, and I want to get your guys' thoughts on this.
Crypto bros make money literally by making money, and they've made over $1 trillion out of thin air. They'll accuse the U.S. government of making money out of thin air. Maybe we do, but we're the U.S. government.
Wow. I hadn't seen that. That's great. Yeah.
Maybe we do, but we're the U.S. government. And then this kind of reminds me of, I have this tweet pinned on the top of my Twitter, and I definitely took a lot of influence from Ayn Rand. And I basically said, I refuse to work for money that another man can create for free. I don't care that you're the U.S. government. I don't care. The fact that you can just literally create money for free that everyone's putting time and energy and work and all this stuff into. And then not to mention all the unintended consequences of having a system that is completely misaligned, right? Whether that's the corruption in politics down your alley, Stephen, and I'm sure you've gone down this rabbit hole, and we should definitely take the conversation this direction, and what's that's done to health as well, right? It's misaligned the incentives of society in general as a whole, in the pharmaceutical industry as well. You guys remember the food pyramid? Do you remember we were taught that in school as if it was a fact, as if it was a reason, it was the true thing? Yeah. Anyways, Stephen, do you have any thoughts on Representative Sherman?
So I want to just real quick. So I'm going to call out John Haar here, who's part of the Swan private team. He's one of the MDs at Swan. He was forever radicalized by the food pyramid. The food pyramid was the single thing which broke his trust in institutions and has never recovered. It was too far for him. So what's up, John? Do I have comments on Sherman? So, I think, it can seem like kind of this like gotcha, like, oh my God, they admitted they're just printing money from thin air. But like, I think the thing to keep in mind is like, that's the deal. Like, no, like that's the system, right? And like, it's their argument. Like if we were to have them on here, Sherman, or maybe someone smarter than Sherman who could articulate what he really means, they would argue essentially that, yeah, we might be printing money from thin air, but the system works, doesn't it? That's the argument. And so, if the system did work, if that were true, and the US government printing money from thin air was the most efficient system we could have for economic growth and human well-being, well, then it wouldn't matter as much, right? You could make kind of a moral argument, but if it was the best system and if it did produce the most economic growth, you could be like, hey, okay, that's pretty legitimate. Like the argument we have to make is that that's not true. That's not true at all. And the issue is not, it's not that you do it. It's not that you print the money. It's that the act of printing the money distorts. I've always framed this as it distorts the amount of information embedded in the system. And so when you think of like complex systems and you think of these very dynamic, emergent, complex systems where a lot of spontaneous order manifests. So an economy is one of those. It's why the Soviet Union failed, right? They had an emergent, dynamic, spontaneously ordered system, the economy, that they tried to control from the top down. Another example is an ecosystem. You can't plant a forest. They tried in Germany. It was a disaster. And so you can kind of look at those systems and say that there is embedded information. There is intelligence within the system. And my argument with the money printing is that it distorts and impairs the inherent information processing in the complex system that is our economy. And so the money printing is bad because it is not the best system. It doesn't work the best. It distorts incentives. It distorts capital formation, and it impairs this kind of complex machinery that we all rely on, not just to live, but to move civilization forward. And this goes to your point, Nico, of like these other deteriorations of health and culture and like beautiful buildings and all of these things that, you walk through. This is another John Harr shout out, but like you walk through New York City, and if you see a beautiful building, like a truly beautiful building, a building which like the creators obviously cared about the aesthetics, it's detailed, it's carved, it's beautiful. And you look up when it was built, it's always before 1930. John has like he's going to do a whole thread on this, but he photographs them and he checks their construction date. And so coming back to my point about the progress of civilization, right? Like these incentives and this machinery, this system and the information embedded in it, like as this gets distorted, as it collapses, as it becomes less efficient and less organic, like you see this like thrust of civilization start to deteriorate in some ways. And it's broad. We've talked about this before. I'm not comfortable reducing it all down to the money. And I think there's actually a loss of like literally like a metaphysical void. I think there is a complete deconstruction of metaphysics and values. There's kind of the postmodern condition. I think that played a huge role. But, we can talk about the monetary side of it. And you just see the civilizational engine get impaired. And I'm highlighting that, making a long point, but I'm highlighting that because it's not just about everybody having a good GDP growth. It's not just about like enough stuff, right? Like stuff is relatively hollow. If you're starving, yeah, you want more stuff. But to say that the only point of human civilization is to create enough material goods for us all to be satiated, it misses the mark of what it means to be human. And what it means to be human is the advancement of culture, of aesthetics, of art, of purpose, of having a cohesive cultural engine that actually moves us into the future. And so far from just impairing the economic conditions, I actually think it has impaired our cultural standing and our cultural engine.